Hello everyone and welcome to another video with me, Ellie. As you probably know, I've been making a lot of stitch markers and progress keepers recently, so I thought I'd make a video explaining some of the very many ways to use them. I'm not going to cover everything that there is because I'm sure there's things I haven't thought of, but these are just some of the ways that I like to use stitch markers. When I first started knitting and crocheting, I didn't really know any of these uses, and I think I really missed out a lot. They might be small, but they're a really handy little tool to have when you're knitting or crocheting. I must admit, you don't actually need anything fancy like the things I've been making, like this sort of thing, but you can use earrings or rings or scraps of thread. There's loads of things you can use in place, so if you're just starting, you can try those out and see if you'd like to use them. But after a while, I really fell in love with the way that using something like this, which has like a little design, really adds like a little bit of personality and extra charm to the project I'm knitting. So whenever I pick up this sock, then I always feel happy when I see this little star here. So that's just something that I enjoy. So to start off with, I just want to talk a little bit about the difference between stitch markers and progress keepers. Now again, full disclaimer, this is just the way I think about them. Obviously some people call everything stitch markers and they're all just stitch markers, but I like to differentiate between them. So to me, this is a stitch marker because it goes on your needle and it kind of sits on either, you can have two and they sit on either side of a stitch and they mark that stitch, or can be on either side of a pattern repeat and they mark that pattern repeat. Whereas to me, this is a progress keeper because you like hook it on to your work and you can use it for tracking progress and all sorts of other things. So I like to distinguish between them like that, but a lot of people will call all of these stitch markers. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a few ways of using progress keepers. And one way is to mark the front of your work. So let's say for this tube, then it's very, like the front and the back look exactly the same, especially as I've actually already woven in my beginning tail. And so if I want to know what is the front of the work and what is the back of the work, then having this progress keeper here will help me know, like, okay, this is the front of my work. Another example is for this is a shawl, and here I have it. Here the front and the back is a little bit more obvious because I've got like pearl stitches on the back, but if you're a beginner you still might not be certain, or maybe you're using a pattern that alternates stockinette and reverse stockinette, and then having a stitch marker on the right side of the work will help you remember, okay, now I've got the right side facing me. I use a stitch marker to mark the front of the work, like when I'm knitting flat, like all the time. It's very important to me. Like, so if I'm doing decreases or increases only on the right side of the work, then I just have to look, oh yeah, this is a stitch marker, this is the right side of the work, I'm doing my decreases or my increases. I'm thinking of like a sleeve or something like that. So that's really useful. Okay. Then another thing that I do is maybe also to mark, for this I'm actually knitting a sock tube. I'm going to add in the heel and the toe afterwards, so I'm going to cut and add it in. It's called an afterthought sock, and afterthought heel and an afterthought toe. And so I have marked the first stitch of the round here, so I know that this like column of stitches is the first stitch. And that's going to help me in the future when I want to add my toe and I want to add my heel. I'm going to make sure that when I'm starting to pick up the stitches, I'm going to be starting with this first one, because I don't want my heel to be facing one way and my toe to be facing the opposite way, and then the sock won't actually fit on your foot. They need to be facing in the same direction. So that's another way that you can use a progress keeper. You can also use a progress keeper to mark the beginning of a section. So that's not really like something that's going on in here, but if I had like maybe finished knitting straight and I was now going to be doing increases, and it said that you need to increase until that section measures, actually it would probably be the other way, so you've already done your increases and now you're going to knit straight, and you're going to knit straight until the straight section measures 20 centimeters. I'm just making this up. Then you mark the beginning of that section, and then whenever you're measuring you can just measure down to where that mark is, and you know, okay, that's how many, instead of having to look, okay, where was my last increase or my last decrease, and having to kind of read your knitting, you can just look at where the progress keeper is, and that will help you know, okay, that's where I've got to measure to. It's just a more obvious thing to be able to measure against. Another thing you can do is also for marking for like if you're measuring, so if you're trying to figure out like how many rows per inch, you can mark the beginning and end of the inch with the progress keepers. So I would put one at the top, one at the bottom of an inch, and then you can more easily count between them because the progress keeper is giving you a more obvious place to begin with. They're also good for counting if, so when I knit a sock, when I knit the foot, then I will just slip in a marker every 10 rows, and then at the end I'll be able to know how many rows that sock is for that person. So let's say my husband, I usually knit, I think it's like 77 rows, then if I've put in a stitch marker every 10 rows, then I just have to count 10 stitch markers plus 7 rows afterwards, and it just makes counting much easier because you've got your progress keeper there busy, like very big visual reminder of what you're doing. So I'm going to move on to crochet things now as well. These are also really useful for crocheting. So if you, like, let's say I'm joining these squares together, and I've decided that the pink one is going to go after the blue one, but then something happens, the phone rings, and I don't know, there's an emergency, I've got to leave or something. I don't know why I would stop crocheting, but say something happens, something comes up, and I'm not sure, maybe I've got like a big pattern on either side, and I'm not really sure. I can just slip in a marker, and, a progress keeper, and if I add it onto here, then I'll know next time I come, if I'm joining, then I know, okay, I was going to join onto this side, I wasn't going to join it onto the purple. So that's just a really easy way. This actually happened, my mom was joining a blanket, and they weren't colors that were repeating in a way that was obvious to look at, so she had actually thankfully taken a photo of them all laid out before she added, but she kept forgetting which side she was joining to, and so I lent her one of my progress keepers, and she just kept adding it in, and it really helped her remember which side she was joining to. So that's a really great thing. You can also, when you are joining things, you can take some of them and you can put them like that, and you can kind of clip them together, so that obviously this is quite a short piece, so it's not going to make like a big difference, but if you clip both ends, then you know that your stitches are going to line up better, and then you can also kind of see how it looks because it's like attached using these. Another thing is, I don't actually have a piece to demonstrate with, but basically if you're crocheting and you want to crochet, like you're chaining and you're going to start maybe a blanket project and it's going to be like 250 stitches, that's a lot of stitches to have to keep counting. So what you can do is, again, you can take one of these progress keepers and you can clip it like every 10 or 20 stitches, you can clip it on. I'm like quite quick, so I'll do it every 50 stitches, but if you're just beginning, you might want to do it every 10 stitches, and then you just have to count how many markers you have and then times that by 10, and then you know how many stitches you have. So it makes it much easier that you don't have to like keep ripping back and recounting like hundreds of stitches. Final thing for crochet is actually two here. So let's say that you were working in the round, or even not in the round, even if you're knitting flat, crocheting flat. If you need to put your work down, a great thing is to have a progress keeper that you can put in your live loop so that it can't get pulled out and it can't unravel when you're not looking. So that's a really great thing. I'd use that all the time. It's super helpful. So that's just so you can put your project away and you don't have to worry about anything coming undone. But the other thing you can also do is mark the beginning. If you're working in a spiral, it can be really difficult to remember where the beginning of the round is, and you might be doing like increases or something, so every single time it's going to be a different number and you got to keep counting. It's just really frustrating. You just put in a progress keeper and then you know you're just doing your increases normally until you get to that progress keeper, and then you've done a full round. So that's super helpful for crochet. Okay, now I'm going to talk a little bit about stitch markers, or the kind that go on your actual needle. And these I actually have less uses for. I can only think of two, but obviously if anyone else has any ideas, please comment them down below. We'd love to know other uses for these sort of stitch markers. And I actually don't know of any for crochet. But for knitting, The first is that you can put them on either side of a stitch repeat. So I didn't have a perfect example, but here you can see that all along the side I have a garter stitch edge, and then in the inside my pattern keeps changing. So I just have two little stitch markers on either side so that I know I'm doing garter stitch for the first stitches until I get to my stitch marker, and once I slip my stitch marker, then I'm working whatever pattern repeat my pattern has told me to do. And you can also use this for something like down here at the bottom. This is worked in, I think it was sets of 6, or maybe it was sets of 12, but you could have a stitch marker at each point wherever the pattern is repeating and you've got to start again doing what it's told you at the beginning. Then you can add in another stitch marker to help you remember that. It's particularly useful when you're doing things like lace and that sort of thing. Or cables, I also find it helpful if you've got something else going on the sides and a cable down the middle. It's also helpful to have stitch markers there. And the final thing for stitch markers is using to mark the beginning of the round. Now, I don't have a perfect example because I don't actually knit. I knit magic loop when I knit in the round, which is very obvious where the beginning of the round is, but I've just inserted a stitch marker here just to show you. So let's pretend that I was knitting on circular needles that I wasn't doing magic loop, or maybe I'm knitting with double pointed needles. Then I might need to mark the beginning of the round, and then so you would just pop your stitch marker in the stitch before or the stitch after your last stitch, so it's snug in between two other stitches. And then I'll just show you. This is why you do have to, sorry, these other ones are dragging on the table. You do have to be careful with these sorts of stitch markers, the ones that are closed, because you do not want to knit them into your work. So what you do is we're going to knit the first two stitches normally, and then when we get to this last one, do not yarn over. So you slip it from one needle to the other like this without knitting it. If I was to knit it, it would be on that needle, and I would put it's kind of difficult, but oops, if I do it through the back, if I yarned over and pulled it through, then that's actually now stuck in my knitting, and you would have to cut your knitting or pick back or whatever to get that out. So you don't want to do that. You want to be sure to just slip it from the one needle to the other. It's just hanging there loose, it's not caught in or anything, and then you can go back to knitting normally, and there we go. And that's part of why I haven't really thought of a way to use these stitch markers for crochet, because crochet, you don't really have these live stitches. You always are finishing off the stitch, and so this type would just get caught in and you'd have to cut it out. But yeah, that's just how we use these sort of stitch markers. I just wanted to give a quick demonstration. They're slightly more complicated. You could, when I make these, I do like to make these with a very big lobster claw. I don't use the small sorts of ones that you find on like jewelry necklaces and that sort of thing, partially because I find that they snag more on the yarn when you're using them. But also because this is big, you can actually use that. I could slip it on here and keep knitting. I find it's a bit bulky, and so it gets in the way a bit, and I don't enjoy knitting with that on the needle as much as this one. I've designed it to have, this is quite common, to have a very thin wire, whereas this is quite thick and it could get in the way, but that's not to say you couldn't use it. And then obviously because it has a hook, if you did accidentally knit it into your work, you could unclip it. So that would be a benefit of using that. Sorry for all the scratchy noises on the table. So that's it for my video explaining how some of the uses that you can use for stitch markers and progress keepers. Thank you so much for watching. As a reminder, I do have a bunch of stitch markers and progress keepers for sale on my Folksy store, so I will link to that down below. And if you've enjoyed this video, please leave it a like and consider subscribing. Did you know that only 18% of my viewers are subscribed? Have a great day and stay crafty.